Welcome to the Veil Weaver. Come in, settle yourself somewhere comfortable. Let the weight of the day begin its slow release. Down through your shoulders, down through your back, down into whatever is holding you. You don't need it any further tonight. It can wait. I want to tell you something before we begin tonight's journey. Something I have been sitting with for a long time, turning over in the way that you turn over a stone you have found in the dark and are not entirely sure you want to see the underside of. Every culture on earth, every single one, without exception, across every ocean and every mountain range, and every stretch of time from the earliest civilizations to the present day, has told a story about a woman who drinks blood. Not a man, not a creature of ambiguous gender. A woman. She has 1,000 names and 1,000 faces. She lives in the oldest cities of ancient Mesopotamia, and in the dense forests of medieval Poland, and in the humid darkness of Southeast Asian night, and on the storm-lit peaks of the Scottish Highlands, and in the sugarcane fields of Trinidad. She speaks in incantations that are 4,000 years old, and in whispered warnings passed between mothers in villages that have no written history. She is feared, and she is appeased, and she is sometimes, not always, but sometimes, quietly pitied. But she is always there. I have been asking myself why for a long time. Why this particular figure? Why always female? Why blood, specifically? Not simply death, not simply danger, but this very specific taking of something vital from inside the body. Why does the imagination return to this, independently, in civilization after civilization, that had no contact with each other, and no shared language, and no way of knowing that the story they were telling in their particular corner of the world was being told simultaneously in a dozen other corners? There are answers. Scholars of folklore and mythology and anthropology and psychology have offered many of them, and some of them are convincing, and some of them are partial, and none of them is entirely sufficient. The one I keep returning to is the simplest. The blood-drinking woman is what gets produced when a culture encounters the power of the female body, its capacity to give life, to sustain life, to bleed and survive bleeding, and cannot accommodate that power within its ordinary categories. The power has to go somewhere, and if it cannot be contained within the categories of the normal world, it gets projected outward, into the dark, into a figure that carries all the awe and fear that the normal world cannot hold. She is the mirror. She has always been the mirror. What I want to do tonight is look at her clearly, not to explain her away, not to reduce her to a psychological mechanism or a sociological function, because she is more interesting than that, and the stories that contain her are richer than that. But to look at her, all the versions of her, from the oldest to the most recent, from the most terrifying to the most poignant, with the specific quality of attention that comes from genuinely wanting to understand, rather than simply to be frightened. We are going to travel tonight, further than we have traveled in a single night before, across continents, across centuries, across traditions that have no knowledge of each other, and yet keep arriving at the same dark door. We begin where everything begins, in the oldest cities in the world, between two rivers, in the first civilization to write anything down, where she was already there, waiting, before the writing began. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the land that the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the world's first cities rose out of the flat, fertile plain. Ur, Uruk, Nineveh, Babylon, cities of mud brick and ziggurat, of cuneiform pressed into wet clay and left to dry into permanence, of the first writing and the first law codes and the first astronomical records and the first attempts to organize human life at the scale of a city rather than a village. And in those cities, in the houses of the merchants and the palaces of the kings and the temples of the priests and the modest homes of the farmers who fed the whole system, in every one of those structures, without exception, there were amulets, pressed clay tablets inscribed with incantations, bronze plaques with specific images, figurines placed at the threshold or hung above the bed or buried in the corners of rooms. Not decorative, not simply religious in the general sense of gesturing toward the divine, specific, targeted, made to protect against one particular threat above all others. Her name was Lamashtu. She is the oldest blood-drinking female figure in recorded history, old enough that the earliest texts that mention her are already describing an established fear. She is not a new invention, but an acknowledged presence, something the culture has been negotiating with for long enough that the negotiation has developed protocols, the amulets, the incantations, the specific rituals to be performed during pregnancy and childbirth. All of it accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations, about how to keep her away from the most vulnerable moments of human life. What did she look like? The texts and the amulets agree, with the consistency of descriptions that have been carefully preserved because accuracy mattered. She had the head of a lioness, with the teeth of a donkey. Her body was covered in hair. Her hands were stained. The texts say stained, without specifying with what, though in context, the implication is clear. Her fingers were long, and her nails longer. Her feet were the talons of a great bird. She's often depicted kneeling on the back of a donkey, holding a snake in each hand, with a dog suckling at one breast and a pig at the other. She is not beautiful. Most of the blood-drinking women we will meet tonight use beauty as their first instrument, their primary approach. Lamashtu does not need to. She simply arrives. She was the daughter of Anu, the sky god, the highest of the high, the most powerful of the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy. This is important and worth pausing on. She is not a creature of the underworld, not a demon generated by the forces of chaos and darkness, not the shadow inverse of the divine order. She is the daughter of the chief god. She belongs, in some essential and deeply uncomfortable way, to the very top of the hierarchy that she terrorizes. And unlike every other demon in the Mesopotamian world, unlike every other malevolent supernatural force that Babylonian and Sumerian and Akkadian mythology ever named and described, Lamashtu acts on her own. She does not receive instructions from the gods. She does not carry out divine punishment on behalf of the cosmic order. She acts entirely from her own will, her own desire, her own purposes, which are opaque and do not require justification. This makes her, in the terms of her own world, a form of rebellion, a divine daughter who refuses the roles available to divine daughters and goes her own way. And her own way involves targeting the most vulnerable, the pregnant, the laboring, the newly born, the infants at the breast. What did she do? She touched the bellies of pregnant women, and the pregnancies ended. She arrived at births, and the births went wrong. She entered houses where infants slept, and she lifted them from their beds, and she put her own terrible breasts, the ones with the dog and the pig, to the mouths of the children, and the milk that came from her killed. She drank the blood of infants, and ate their flesh, and ground their bones. She spread nightmares and fever and disease. She infested rivers and poisoned wells and killed the green things in fields. She was, to use the words that the Babylonians used of her themselves, the most terrible of all female demons. Not the most powerful. There are more powerful figures in the Mesopotamian cosmos. Not the most evil in some abstract philosophical sense. Simply the most terrible. The one most likely to destroy the specific things that matter most. The children, the mothers, the continuation of life itself. An ancient incantation against her, preserved in the clay tablets, goes like this. Great is a daughter of heaven who tortures babies. Her hand is a net. Her embrace is death. She is cruel, raging, angry, predatory. A runner, a thief is a daughter of heaven. A runner, a thief. Not a slow, lurking presence, but something that moves fast, that takes quickly, that is gone before you have properly registered its arrival. The Mesopotamians protected themselves against her with specific and detailed protocols. Pregnant women and new mothers wore amulets bearing her image, the logic being that carrying her image would keep the real thing at a distance, a kind of decoy. Figurines of Pazuzu, the wind demon who was her enemy and her consort in various accounts, were placed at the entrances to homes. Pazuzu was not a kind figure himself. He brought drought and locusts and famine. But he was Lamashtu's adversary, and an adversary of your adversary is something you can work with. Specific incantations were recited 3 times daily during vulnerable periods. The body of the sick child might be placed near a Lamashtu figurine for 3 days, the figurine carrying the illness away from the child and into itself. On the 3rd day, at dusk, the figurine was buried near the wall of the house. These are not primitive superstitions in the sense of being ignorant attempts to deal with things that people simply didn't understand. They are technologies of the fearful, specific, practical, responsive to the specific terror of infant death and maternal mortality that was a constant reality in an ancient world. Lamashtu was the shape that the fear of those deaths took. She was the explanation, and the explanation came with protocols, and the protocols gave people something to do with the helplessness. She is still there, in a sense, in the archaeological record. The amulets survive in museums. The cuneiform tablets survive in archives. A bronze plaque from northern Iraq, 9th to 7th century BCE, now in the British Museum, shows exactly the scene described in the texts. The lioness head, the bird feet, the donkey she kneels on, the snakes in her hands, the animals at her breasts. Someone made this. Someone wore this, or hung it above a bed where a pregnant woman slept, or placed it at the entrance to a room where a new child had just arrived into the world. Someone was afraid, and the fear had this specific shape, and the shape was a woman. From Lamashtu flows a tradition, the Ardat Lily, the class of Mesopotamian ghost demons, who are the spirits of young women who died before their time. before marriage and children and the completion of the life that was expected of them, who returned in their frustration and their hunger to prey on the living. Their very existence encodes a cultural assumption that a woman's life was not complete until she had fulfilled certain roles, and that the failure to fulfill those roles, whether by dying young or by being denied the opportunity, produced something dangerous. And from Ardat Lili and from Lamashtu together flows Lilith, or Lilitu, in the Babylonian, which is where she begins before the Jewish tradition absorbs her and rewrites her into the story of Adam and Eden. In Babylon, she is already a night-stalking wind demon, already associated with the killing of infants, already carrying in her the combination of feminine power and dark predation that will make her one of the most durable figures in Western mythology. Lilith's later story, the first wife of Adam, created from the same clay at the same moment, who refused to be subordinate and was exiled from the garden and became a demon who preys on sleeping men and steals newborns from their cribs, is a story told in medieval Jewish texts centuries after Babylon. But the character, the specific qualities of her power and her danger, travel directly from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. She is the oldest shape of the fear. She predates the religions that inherited her. She was here before the texts that described her, and she has outlasted most of the civilizations that tried to contain her with amulets and incantations. She is the daughter of the sky god, and she acts entirely from her own will. And she does not stop. West of Babylon, across the mountain ranges and the long Mediterranean coast, another civilization was building its own vocabulary for the dark, Greece, and then Rome, two cultures so intertwined that their mythologies became, over centuries, largely the same mythology told in different languages with different names. They had their witches. We have visited those already, in a different night, Circe and Medea and Hecate at her crossroads. But they also had something older and less human than any of those. Creatures that were not primarily practitioners of magic, but primarily predators. Creatures whose defining quality was hunger. Lamia came first, or she came first in the written record, which is not the same as coming first in the tradition. Figures like her exist in the spaces beneath written culture, in the oral warnings passed between parents and children, in the shape of the fear before anyone thought to write the fear down. She was, in the oldest accounts, a queen, a beautiful mortal queen of Libya who was loved by Zeus and who bore him children, several of them in the versions that are most generous to her history. And then Hera found out, as Hera always found out. Zeus's wife, whose fury at her husband's infidelities could not be directed at her husband because he was Zeus, because the asymmetry of power in that marriage was absolute and total, directed itself instead at the women he loved and the children they bore him. Hera killed Lamia's children, all of them, and she placed on Lamia a curse that she could never close her eyes, that she could never sleep, that she must remain permanently awake with the full and unobstructed awareness of what she had lost, the grief and the sleeplessness, and the permanence of both transformed her. What she became is described in the ancient sources with the usual variety of detail that attends to creatures who exist in the oral tradition before they exist in written texts. Her form shifts between accounts. Her specific attributes vary. but the core is consistent. She became a serpentine creature, or a creature with the serpent's lower half, who preyed on children, who could not have her own children, and so fed on the children of others, who drank their blood and ate their flesh with the specific, terrible hunger of someone who is trying to fill a space that cannot be filled. In some accounts, she was given, by a pitying Zeus, a compensatory gift, the ability to remove her own eyes, to take them out and put them aside when the seeing became too much, to choose, occasionally, not to witness what she had become and what the world had done to her. I find myself sitting with that detail for a long time. The gift of removable eyes, given to a woman cursed to never sleep, never stop seeing. The mercy of the option to not look, given not by the God who caused the situation, but by the same God who could not undo what his wife had done and could not stop doing the things that caused it, but could offer this small, strange, insufficient comfort. You can choose not to see. The world will still be there when you put the eyes back in. From Lamia, the name became a category. In later Greek usage, Lamia was a word for female demons generally, the specific queen of Libya, whose story had generated the original figure disappearing into a general concept of the blood-drinking female monster. This is a pattern we will see again. The specific woman whose specific tragedy generates a specific fear, and then the fear outlasting the woman, the category surviving the origin. Empusa came from a different part of the Greek world's darkness. She was the servant of Hecate, and those who have spent time with Hecate in other stories will recognize the crossroads quality, the between-place quality, the goddess who moves at the boundary between the living and the dead. Empusa moved along those boundaries too, in a specific direction. She was a shapeshifter. Primarily, she could appear as a beautiful young woman, or as a dog, or as a cow. And the most dangerous form was the woman, because the woman was the one designed to draw men in close enough for the other thing. The other thing being, she was bronze-footed. In one account, the beautiful woman's legs ending in the burnished metal of a material that does not belong in a living body. She fed on blood, and on something harder to name, a life force, a vitality, drawn out of sleeping men through contact rather than bite, the way a drain works, the way warmth leaves a body when it has been still too long in the cold. She was an omen too. To encounter Empusa on the road, particularly at crossroads, Hecate's territory, was to know that something bad was coming. Not from her, necessarily. Simply coming. She was the messenger before the message. And then Rome took all of this and added its own darkness. The Strix. The word means screech owl in Latin, and the connection between owls and blood-drinking female demons runs deep through multiple traditions. We will meet it again later tonight in very different places. But the Roman Strix was specific. A woman who could transform into an owl at night, who flew to the cribs of infants and drank from them, who arrived at the window with a particular cry that those who heard it knew to dread. Ovid writes about her. Pliny the Elder mentions her as an established folk belief. She appears in Roman legal texts as something that people actually accused other women of being, which tells you something important about the social life of the Strix. The way the creature moved between mythology and accusation, between the story told around a fire and the charge leveled at a specific woman in a specific community. The Strix is where the story changes register. Everything before her Lamashtu, Lilith, Lamia, Empusa exists in the realm of mythology, of creatures outside ordinary human society. The Strix begins the long, terrible tradition of the accusation, of the blood-drinking female demon as something a living woman might be, of the fear turning inward toward the community itself, toward the neighbor whose children inexplicably survived, toward the old woman who lived alone at the edge of the village, toward any woman who existed outside the careful bounds of the expected. The Strix traveled. As Rome's empire spread and contracted, and the Latin language persisted in the cultures that Rome had touched, the word Strix became Strzyga in Italian, Strzyga in Romanian, Strzyga in Polish, Strzyga in Albanian. The same creature, adapting to each new home, putting down roots in different soils, producing different flowers of fear in different climates. One of those flowers is where we go next. The forests of medieval Poland are a different kind of dark from anything we have encountered so far tonight. Not the flat, river-plain dark of Mesopotamia, where the danger comes across open ground and announces itself. Not the Mediterranean dark of wine and islands and the particular bright malevolence of Lamia and Empusa, creatures who live in the same landscape as the heroes who fear them. The Polish dark is dense. The forests are old and enormous and continuous, stretching for miles without clearing, full of the sounds of things that move at night and the sounds of things that do not move and might be anything. Villages sit in clearings like islands in a dark sea. The distance between one settlement and the next is measured in the amount of courage it requires to cross it. In this landscape, the specific quality of the fear is different too. The Strzyga is not a creature that arrives from outside. She is not a demon from a distant realm, not a divine daughter gone wrong, not a foreign queen transformed by grief. She is from here. She was born here. She grew up in a house at the end of a lane that everyone in the village knows. She sat by the same fire. She spoke the same language, and she was born wrong. This is the Strzyga's specific horror, and it is different from everything else in this episode. She is not made into a monster by grief, or exile, or divine punishment, or the trauma of dying in childbirth. She is born a monster. Not all at once, not visibly. She lives her life as a person, apparently, for as long as she lives. But from the beginning, something in her is doubled. 2 hearts, 2 souls, 2 sets of teeth. The second barely visible, pressed behind the first like a shadow with substance. These anomalies, in the folklore of rural Poland, were signs, not just of difference, but of a specific kind of difference, the kind that meant that when this person died, the dying would not take cleanly, that one soul would depart as souls are supposed to depart, moving on to wherever souls go, but the other soul would stay, would remain in the body, trapped between the living world and the next one, unable to leave and unable to fully inhabit either, and the body, animated by that remaining soul, would rise. The Strzyga who rises is different from the person who died. Not completely. The face is still recognizable, the voice still known, which is one of the sources of her particular terror. She looks like someone you loved. She sounds like someone who trusted you. But her skin has gone grey or blue, in the specific way of dead flesh that is not exactly dead. Her eyes have changed, and over time, as she continues to rise and hunt and return to her grave by day, the bird qualities begin to show. The claws, the feathers growing at the back of the neck, the capacity to fly, eventually, as an owl. And here is the Roman Strix. Here is the screech owl that travelled from Latin into Polish and became this specific creature in this specific dark. What does she hunt? Blood, primarily. The blood of people she encounters on the night roads. Travellers who chose the wrong night to move between one place and another. But also something harder to name. The vitality, the living warmth, the specific quality of aliveness that the Strzyga lacks and seeks in those who have not yet lost it. She drains this the way the cold drains warmth from a room with an open window. Gradually, persistently, until there is none left. She can also be motivated by revenge. This is the detail that the Polish tradition returns to, with a particular emphasis. The Strzyga sometimes hunts not at random, but with purpose, directed toward people who wronged her in her first life. The neighbor who cheated her, the man who abandoned her, the community that drove her out. And communities did drive out those suspected of being Strzygi, sometimes before they had even died. The suspicion of the double birth enough to make a person unwelcome. This is the cruelest part of the story, and the part that the folklore itself seems aware of. The Strzyga was often identified in childhood, or even at birth. The extra teeth, the doubled heartbeat if you pressed your ear to the chest. And when identified, she was frequently expelled from the village, cast out before she had done anything, before the second death that would release the second soul, on the basis of what she might become. The accusation preceding the act, the punishment preceding the crime. And then, when she died young, as the expelled and the outcast often did die young, alone and unsheltered, and without the protection of community, her second soul rose, and she came back. And sometimes she came back to the village that had expelled her. The question the tradition asks, and does not answer. How much of the monster was made by the fear of the monster? How much of the Strzyga's return was produced by the very act of driving her away in the first place? The methods of preventing her return were specific and various. Burning the body, decapitation, the head buried separately from the body so the two halves could not reconnect, burying the body face down so that if she rose, she would dig in the wrong direction and go deeper into the earth rather than up toward the light. A sickle placed around the neck, the curved blade that would cut if she tried to turn her head, nails through various parts of the body, small objects placed in the grave for her to count, the counting keeping her occupied through the night until dawn made her return. All of these are technologies of containment. All of them assume that the thing is real and must be managed. None of them, not a single one, involves asking whether the identification had been correct in the first place, whether the girl with two sets of teeth had been anything other than a girl with a dental anomaly, whether the double heartbeat had been an arrhythmia rather than an extra soul. The forest at the edge of the village is very quiet tonight. The graves at the edge of the forest are quieter still. The Strzyga, if she is there, will not emerge until dark. And dark in the Polish winter comes early and stays long, which is perhaps why the tradition is so detailed, so carefully maintained. There is a lot of dark to fill with precautions. Stay on the road. Walk in the middle of it, not the edges. Do not stop. Do not look back. And if you hear something moving in the trees that is not quite the sound of an animal, and not quite the sound of a person. Keep walking. Leave the forests of Poland behind. Travel west, across the continent, across the Channel, up into the islands at the edge of Europe, where the land becomes increasingly dramatic in its declaration of what it is. Scotland, the Highlands specifically, the high, rugged, improbably beautiful country of the north, where the mountains come down to the water, and the glens hold their weather the way hands hold water. Oh, briefly, in cupped palms before it all runs out between the fingers. Heather-covered hillsides and cold lochs, and the particular quality of Highland light on overcast days, which is not grey in the way that people who have not seen it imagine grey to be, but rather a kind of luminous silver, as though the sky is not withholding the light, but diffusing it, distributing it evenly across everything so that nothing is in shadow and nothing is quite bright. At night, this landscape is different. At night, the glens are dark in a way that feels personal. The distances between settlements, already large in daylight, become enormous. The sounds that the hillsides make, the wind through the heather and the water moving in the burns, and the occasional distant cry of something that might be a bird or might be the particular note the wind produces when it finds a gap in the stone walls of an old shieling. These sounds take on a different quality. This is the country of the Baobhan Sith. The name is Gaelic, pronounced Baobhan She, and it means fairy woman, which is a deceptively gentle way of describing something that is not gentle at all. She is counted among the Sith, the supernatural beings of Scottish Gaelic tradition who inhabit the other world, but move through this one with a freedom that the living do not have. She is also, specifically and unmistakably, a blood drinker. Not in the way of the creatures we have met so far tonight, not born from grief or divine punishment, or the horror of dying in childbirth. She simply is what she is. She has always been what she is, and what she is, beautiful. This is the first and most important fact about the Baobhan Sith, the one that makes everything else possible. She appears as a young woman of extraordinary beauty, wearing a long green dress, green being the colour of the fairy folk in Scottish tradition, the colour of the other world's intrusion into this one. The dress is long enough to reach the ground, long enough to cover her feet entirely. This is not vanity. The dress hides the fact that where her feet should be, she has the hooves of a deer. She appears in the stories to hunters, almost always hunters, men who have been out on the hillsides all day in the cold, tracking deer through the heather, coming back to a bothy or a shieling to shelter for the night. They have blood on their clothes from the day's work. The Baobhan Sith is drawn to blood in a way that she is drawn to express desire, which is the other condition for her appearance. She appears when she is wished for. The story that is told most consistently in multiple versions from different parts of the Highlands goes like this. 4 men sheltering in a bothy for the night. One of them provides music, a fiddle, or simply his voice, the rhythmic pulse of something that can be danced to. The others begin to dance, and as they dance in the firelit space of the small dark room, they express, out loud, the thing they want, the thing that would make the night complete, female company, partners to dance with. In the Scottish tradition, there is an old belief. A wish made at night, without the protection of God's name invoked, will be granted. Not kindly, not in the form you imagined it when you made the wish, but granted, the wish fulfilled with a terrible precision that matches the words used and ignores entirely the intention behind them. The men wished for female company. The door opened. 4 women came in, beautiful as they always are, dressed in green. 3 of them moved immediately to the dancers, taking their hands, joining the rhythm of the dance with an ease that should have been its own warning. Human women do not learn a dance in an instant, do not move immediately in perfect time with a music they have never heard. But the men were dancing, and the fire was warm, and the night was outside, doing its cold Highland business, and the caution that the situation warranted was not forthcoming. The 4th Baobhan Sith sat beside the musician, close to him, watching the dance with the quality of attention that predators have, entirely still in themselves, while everything around them moves. The musician noticed after a while that something was falling from his dancing friends onto the floor of the bothy. Blood. He ran out the door and into the night, which takes a specific kind of presence of mind to run out of a warm room into the cold dark of a Highland night in a panic. He ran to the horses, which were tethered outside, and he pressed himself in among them, and he stayed there. The Baobhan Sith, who had been sitting beside him, pursued him to the horses, and then stopped. Iron. The horses were shod with iron, and iron is the one material the Sith cannot abide. The fairy folk's oldest vulnerability. The quality in the metal that disrupts whatever they are made of. She circled. She waited. She did not come in among the horses. Dawn came. She went. He went back inside. His 3 friends were dead, their bodies pale in the way of bodies that have been entirely emptied of what made them warm. The Baobhan Sith hunt in groups. This is noted consistently across the accounts, the pack quality, the coordinated approach. They are not solitary predators. They come in numbers that match the numbers of the men they target, each one choosing her partner with the specific logic of a hunt that has been planned in advance. They shapeshift too. The deer hooves beneath the green dress are one form of the animal that lives beneath the human surface. They can also become wolves, or ravens, or the hooded crow that is the bird of the Highland battlefield, the bird associated with death and aftermath. And there is a specific note in one account that I find haunting in a way the others do not. If a Baobhan Sith has recently fed, she can take the form of the man she has taken, can wear his face, carry his specific voice, walk in through a door that would be opened for him and not for her. The blood as key, the blood as identity, the specific aliveness of a specific person becoming, through the act of taking it, available as a disguise. The Baobhan Sith has no origin story. She has no grief, no transformation, no injustice that shaped her into what she is. She's simply what she is. And what she is has always been there, in the glens, waiting for the wish to be spoken. The Highland night is very quiet now. The fire in the bothy is low. The horses outside shift and breathe in the dark. Do not make wishes after dark. Or if you do, say the name. We are going east now, much further east than we have been in these stories, across the whole of the European continent and beyond it, past the Bosphorus and across the vast plains of Central Asia and into the subcontinent, and the archipelagos beyond it, into a completely different set of climates and languages and religions and ways of organizing the relationship between the living and the dead. And yet we are going to find the same thing. We are going to find her again, the blood-drinking woman, in different clothes, with different names, living in landscapes utterly unlike anything we have seen tonight. But her, the same her, which is, as I said at the beginning, the thing that requires explanation. In this part of the world, the explanation that the tradition reaches for most often is grief, specifically the grief of dying in or around childbirth, the specific catastrophic unfairness of dying at the moment when you are supposed to be giving life. That death, the mother's death in labour, the death that comes in the weeks that follow, the death that arrives just after the child has been held once or never. That death is considered, across South and Southeast Asian folklore, with remarkable consistency, to produce something that does not stay dead, something that returns, something hungry. In the folklore of northern India, spanning traditions that cut across regional and religious lines, appearing in Bengali and Hindi and Urdu and Tamil variations, with enough consistency to suggest something very old underneath all of them. There is the Churel. She was a woman who died under specific circumstances, in childbirth or in the period immediately following birth, before she had recovered and been purified and returned to ordinary life. Or sometimes, a woman who was mistreated, neglected, abused. A woman whose death came from the failure of the people around her to care for her adequately, who died with the specific kind of anger that comes from having been wronged rather than simply having been unlucky. Both origins matter. Both produce the same result. She returns beautiful. This is crucial and consistent. The Churel comes back as a young woman of arresting beauty, the beauty functioning as the primary instrument of her predation. She approaches men, specifically young men, and she draws them away from the village and away from the roads and into the wilderness. And what she takes from them is not simply blood, but time, youth, the specific quality of vitality that belongs to the young, and that the young do not know they have until it is gone. A man who encounters the Churel may come back, but he will come back old, his hair grey, his face lined, his eyes carrying the blank look of someone who has been in a place where the normal rules of time did not apply, and whose body registered the duration even if his mind cannot account for it. He does not always know what happened to him. He knows only that he left as a young man and returned as something else. She can be identified. The tradition is specific about this. By her feet. Her feet point the wrong way. Her toes face backward, toward where she has come from, rather than where she is going. And the heel is where the toes should be. This is the most consistent identifying mark of the Churel across all the regional variations. The reversed feet, the walking that goes in the direction opposite to what her face suggests she is heading. I find myself thinking about what that image encodes. A woman who looks like she is going one way and is actually going another, whose direction cannot be read from the outside, who moves toward you while her feet point away. There is something in the backwards feet that is both a warning and a description of something true about the experience of grief. The way grief moves you in directions you are not expecting. the way you find yourself heading somewhere you did not choose. The backward feet appear in other traditions too. We will meet them again in Malaysia and Indonesia tonight, in creatures who share with Churel, the origin in women who died in the wrong way, at the wrong time. The same image, arrived at independently, in traditions with no documented contact. The same metaphor for the same specific quality of wrongness. Different from the Churel in almost every respect is the Chedipe, a figure from Telugu-speaking southern India, from the folklore of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, whose name means something close to prostitute or outcast woman, and whose nature is distinct enough from the Churel that the two are worth keeping separate, even though both inhabit the same broad category of Indian blood-drinking female spirits. The Chedipe rides a tiger. This alone distinguishes her from almost everything else in tonight's episode. The specific, wild, untamable power of the tiger as her mount, the vehicle of her movement through the night, the declaration that she belongs to the part of the world that contains tigers, and not the part that contains ordinary animals. She enters homes at night, and she drains the men who sleep there, not through wounds, not through a bite or a scratch, but through the foot. She enters through the foot, her method of feeding as strange and specific as her mount. And what she takes is similar to what the Churel takes. Vitality, the quality of being alive and young and whole, drained away while a man sleeps, and his wife lies beside him, and neither of them knows what is happening. In the morning, the man is less. Not dead. The Chedipe is not generally a killer in the way of some of the others we have met tonight, but diminished, weakened, emptied of something he cannot name and cannot reclaim, while the Chedipe is somewhere with her tiger, carrying what she took. Cross the Bay of Bengal, move southeast into the Malay Peninsula and the archipelago beyond it, the thousands of islands that make up modern Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines, where the sea is warm and the forests are dense, and the mythology is rich in exactly the kind of dark that grows in hot, wet, fecund places, where death and life are both very close to the surface. Here, the childbirth death pattern that we saw in the Churel reaches what I think of as its most fully realized form. The figure of the Langsuir is one of the most vivid and most specific in all of tonight's episode, and her origin story is one of the most atmospherically precise. She was a woman of extraordinary beauty, a woman who was pregnant, who waited through her pregnancy with the specific, stretched patience of late pregnancy, who was close to the end of the waiting. And then came the news. Her child was stillborn. The child she had been carrying was already dead when it came into the world. The shock of this, not the grief, the shock, the specific physical, emotional collapse of learning this piece of information undid her. She clapped her hands together, one sharp sound in the air, and without any further warning she flew. She flew whinnying. That is the word the accounts use. Whinnying, the sound of a horse in distress. Away from the house, away from the village, up into the air and into the trees. She landed on a tree and she perched in it like a bird, and she stayed there, having become something new in the moment of the news, having crossed in an instant from the world of the ordinary living into the world of what she was now. What she is now is the Langsuir. She wears her beauty still. The accounts insist on this. the beauty is not lost in the transformation. She is still the woman of extraordinary appearance she was in life. Her hair is black and reaches to her ankles. Her robes are green. Her nails are long in the way that the tradition considers beautiful, tapering to elegant points. She is, in the description, more beautiful than she was as a living woman. But the hair, the ankle-length hair that flows behind her as she flies, is hiding something. At the back of her neck, there is a hole, a small, specific hole through which she feeds, through which she draws the blood of children, her preferred prey, her particular hunger, the children she cannot have herself, the children who belong to other women who did not receive the news she received. She can be tamed. The tradition is specific about this too, in a way that is both practical and deeply strange. If you can catch her, and catching her requires the specific combination of surprise and speed, and the willingness to be close to something that looks entirely human and is not. You can cut her nails and her hair and stuff the cuttings into the hole in her neck. And if you do this, she will become ordinary. She will become a woman who lives in the village, who works, who sleeps a normal sleep, who is, for all apparent purposes, simply a person. There are stories of tamed Langsuirs who married and had children and lived for years in exactly this way, until something happened to make her laugh, genuinely, unself-consciously, freely laugh. And the laughter broke whatever the stuffed hair and nails were holding in place, and she flew again. Joy undid the taming. The laugh that came from a place deeper than the domestication reached was the thing that could not be contained. I sit with that detail. The Langsuir can be made to perform the roles of ordinary womanhood. She can be made to appear, for all visible purposes, settled and safe and domesticated. But the laugh, the expression of something purely and involuntarily her own, something that the ordinary life did not produce, and the ordinary rules did not govern, reaches back to what she actually is, and she flies. The Penanggalan is the Langsuir's cousin, and contrast in Malaysian folklore, related in the family of beings they belong to, utterly different in appearance. Where the Langsuir is beautiful and whole, the Penanggalan is one of the most extreme images in all of world folklore. By day, she is a woman, ordinary, apparently, living in the village, going about the ordinary business of daily life. But at night, she detaches her head from her body, and her head rises into the air, trailing everything that was attached to it from below, her stomach and intestines, the full arrangement of her internal organs, hanging in the dark beneath her floating face. She soaks these organs in vinegar before dawn, the vinegar shrinking them enough to fit back inside the body when she reattaches. The smell of vinegar, therefore, one of the warnings that a Penanggalan lives nearby. She moves through the night in this form, the head and its trailing organs seeking out houses where women are labouring and newborns are vulnerable. She inserts her organ tendrils through the gaps in windows or the spaces beneath doors, and she feeds on the blood of the infant and the weakened mother. Her touch brings fever and disease. The Manananggal of the Philippines is a different flower from the same root, a creature almost exclusively female who can separate not just her head, but her entire upper torso from her lower half, leaving the legs standing on the ground, while the winged upper body flies with her entrails loose beneath her, seeking pregnant women in particular, using a long proboscis-like tongue to reach through walls and take what she is seeking. The detail that strikes me most about both the Penanggalan and the Manananggal is the vulnerability of the lower half, the part left behind, the stationary lower body, the abandoned legs, is where she can be destroyed. Salt on the lower half, or garlic, or ash, prevents the two parts from reattaching before dawn. If she cannot reattach, she dies. She comes apart by choice, to hunt, and the part she leaves behind is the part that can kill her. Across South and Southeast Asia, from the Punjab to the Philippines, through dozens of distinct traditions with different languages and different religions and different relationships to the supernatural, the same pattern. Women who died in the process of giving life, or who carry in them the specific grief of that failure, returning as creatures who take from the living what they were denied. Not random predators, targeted ones, going back to the specific place where what they wanted was the cradle, the new birth, the child that should have been theirs. The grief to predator transformation, the hunger that was first a love. We are going west now, back across the Indian Ocean and the whole breadth of the African continent, to the west coast of Africa, to the forests and the coastal plains of Ghana and the surrounding region, where the Ashanti people built one of the great civilizations of the pre-colonial world. Gold and trade and law and art, and beneath all of it, the specific texture of a spiritual life that understood the relationship between the living and the dead as continuous rather than severed. The dead did not simply go. The dead were available for consultation, for anger, for the continued exercise of whatever they had been in life. This made the boundary between the living and the dead permeable in ways that European Christianity, which arrived later and tried to redraw that boundary with considerable force, found threatening. The permeability was not a malfunction, it was the system. The system included the fact that some of the dead were dangerous, and some of the living were dangerous in very similar ways. And the line between those two categories was not always as clear as it might have appeared. In this world, the Obayifo, she, and the accounts specify female more often than not, though the Obayifo can be male, is not a creature in the same way that Lamashtu is a creature, or the Baobhan Sith is a creature. She is a person. She is your neighbor. She is, in the accounts that describe her, someone you have known for years. Someone who sits at the same fire and eats the same food and participates in the same community life. You would not know, looking at her in the daylight, what she is. At night, her spirit leaves her body, not dramatically, not in the way of the Penanggalan, with the visceral violence of separation. Quietly, the body stays, breathing with the slow regularity of deep sleep. The spirit lifts from it and becomes visible. A phosphorescent glow, a light that drifts through the village and into the forest beyond, moving with the unhurried purpose of something that knows where it is going. She feeds on the vitality of children, preferentially, consistently. The children are her target, the children's life force, the specific thing she takes. The taking does not kill immediately, it wears. The child pales and weakens, loses appetite and weight, and the particular brightness that healthy children have sickens with an illness that has no obvious physical cause and that does not respond to the ordinary remedies. The Ashanti understood this pattern, this specific trajectory of childhood illness, as the Obayifo's work. She also fed on crops, the sap draining from the cocoa trees, the harvest blighting without obvious cause, the fields withering from something invisible and directed. She can be identified if you know what to look for. Her eyes are sharper and more restless than they should be. She shows an unusual interest in food, particularly meat, talking about it, lingering near where the cooking is done, watching the preparation with an attention that exceeds ordinary appetite. At night, if you could see her spirit in transit, it glows. That phosphorescent light, the cold bioluminescence of something that has crossed a boundary that bodies are not supposed to cross. The social logic of the Obayifo is different from the social logic of every other creature we have met tonight. The Strzyga is identified before she acts and expelled. The Baobhan Sith exists entirely outside the community. The Churel comes from outside and takes individual men. But the Obayifo is inside. She is the community itself, a part of it, indistinguishable from the people around her, until the children start to sicken and the crops start to fail. The fear she generates is the fear of the person you trust, the neighbor who has sat at your table, the possibility that malevolence lives inside the social fabric rather than outside it. This is a more corrosive fear than the fear of the outsider. The outsider can be expelled, or at least identified. The insider is everywhere and nowhere. In 1630, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Trinidad. The specific people from specific places, carrying specific stories and specific beliefs, and the specific spiritual technologies they had developed over generations for understanding and managing the relationship between the living, the dead, and the forces that move between them. Those stories and beliefs did not disappear in the crossing of the Atlantic. They could not be confiscated with the physical possessions. They survived in the only way that stories survive, in the mouths and the memories of the people who carried them. In Trinidad, in the communities that formed in the hills and the cane fields, the Obayifo began to change. She was still herself, still the woman who was not what she appeared to be, still the blood taker who moved at night in a form other than the body she wore by day. But she adapted to her new landscape, her new climate, the specific darkness of the Caribbean night, which is different from the darkness of the West African forest. She incorporated the European ideas about vampires and witches that arrived with the French colonists and the Spanish and the British. She found new images and new shapes for old fears. She became the Soucouyant. The Soucouyant is an old woman by day. This is how she appears: elderly, frail, unremarkable, perhaps living at the edge of the village in a small house that the community tolerates, but does not particularly embrace. She begs for small things: salt, matches, the ordinary currency of small kindnesses. And it is important not to give these to her, the tradition warns, because to give the Soucouyant what she asks for is to give her a hold over you. The kindness becomes the vulnerability. At night, she goes into her house and she takes off her skin. This is the defining image of the Soucouyant. The skin removed carefully, left behind in a mortar or hidden in some other safe place. And the skinless self that flies out into the night sky as a ball of fire. A bright, fast-moving fireball above the cane fields, above the sleeping villages. The Soucouyant in her true form, following whatever drew her from her body, and through the night toward the specific house and the specific sleeping person she intends to visit. She enters through a crack, through a gap under a door, through any opening that the house has not sealed against her. She finds the sleeping person, always particular, always chosen in advance, the visitation not random, and she drinks, not deeply enough to kill, not always, though she can, enough to leave marks on the skin in the morning, enough to leave the person weak and pale and vaguely aware, in the way of those who have lost something in sleep, that something has been taken. She must return to her skin before dawn. If she cannot, if someone has found the hiding place and added coarse salt to the mortar where the skin lies, she cannot put it back on. The salt burns the inside of the skin. She cannot return to the body she left. And when the sun rises, the fireball dies. There is also a precaution against visitation. Scatter rice or sesame seeds, or any small objects of sufficient number in front of the house. The Soucouyant cannot enter without counting every grain, every seed, every small thing, and the counting takes the whole night, and the dawn comes, and she has not entered, and she cannot stay. This same precaution appears across the world, in vampire traditions from Eastern Europe to Japan to West Africa. The compulsive counter, the creature who cannot pass a scattered handful of seeds without stopping to number them. Something in the human imagination connects the blood-drinking creature with this specific vulnerability, with the inability to resist counting, to resist the obsessive enumeration of small things. I do not know what to make of this connection. I only notice that it is there, across too many independent traditions to be coincidence. The Soucouyant is described as emerging from two sources simultaneously. The West African Obayifo, which he resembles structurally in almost every important way, and the specific conditions of the Caribbean under the plantation system. Under slavery, where sudden death was common and unexplained, where the body was not your own and its violation was constant, where the community had to develop and maintain its own systems of protection because the official systems were entirely directed toward their exploitation rather than their well-being. In those conditions, the figure of the skin shedder was not simply a folk belief. It was a way of articulating something true about the experience of being in a body that was not fully permitted to be yours. The Soucouyant sheds her skin and becomes something else, something that cannot be contained, something that flies. The fire moves across the Caribbean night. The cane fields are dark and still. Somewhere in a small house at the edge of the village, a mortar holds a skin waiting to be returned to. Count the seeds at your door and keep your salt close. The last place we travel to tonight is the furthest from where we began. From ancient Babylon, we have moved west and east and south, and now we go west again. Further west than Europe, across the Atlantic, and into the continent beyond it, into the Valley of Mexico, into the world of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, the great city built on an island in a lake, the capital of a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary violence. A world that organized itself around the movement of the sun with a precision and a seriousness that the sun, if it had opinions, would have been entirely justified in appreciating. The Aztec world was built on a specific cosmological understanding that the sun required sustenance to continue moving, and that the sustenance it required was blood, human blood. Specifically, the sun had sacrificed itself to move in the mythological account of how the current world came into being, and the blood offerings were the reciprocation, the living repaying the debt to the force that made life possible. In this context, in a world where the deliberate, ritual spilling of blood was not aberration, but cosmological maintenance, what does it mean to die in childbirth? The Aztec answer to this question is one of the most extraordinary things we will encounter tonight. It means, you died in battle. The Aztec warrior who died in battle, the highest, most honored death available to a man in this culture, was considered to have given the ultimate gift to the sun. He had sacrificed his blood in the most direct possible way, and his soul would spend the first 4 years after death accompanying the sun on the eastern half of its journey, the rising half, the half that was the movement from darkness into light. A woman who died in childbirth was considered to have done the same thing. Her labor was her battle. The child she was trying to deliver was, in the metaphor the Aztecs used explicitly and seriously, her captive, the prize of the fight. Her blood, spilled in the struggle to bring new life through her body, was the same offering as the warrior's blood. Her death was the same sacrifice, and her soul received the same honor. She would spend the first 4 years after death accompanying the sun on the western half of its journey, the setting half, the movement from light into darkness, the warrior souls and the woman warrior souls, together, accompanying the sun across the sky. These women had a name, Cihuateteo, divine women, sacred women. The word carries a genuine reverence. These were honored dead, their sacrifice acknowledged, their status in the afterlife equivalent to the most celebrated male warriors. And then the 4 years ended, and they came back. The Cihuateteo returned to the human world on specific days in the Aztec calendar, the days marked with the sign 1 deer, 1 rain, 1 monkey, 1 house, 1 wind. On these days, the Cihuateteo descended at the crossroads. And here is Hecate's territory again. Here is the ancient sacred geography of the between place, appearing in a culture that had no contact with ancient Greece and had arrived at the same spatial logic independently. At the crossroads they gathered, and from the crossroads they moved. They stole children, reached into houses where children slept and took them with the skeletal hands that their 4 years in the western sky had left them, their faces the faces of the dead, fleshless, eyeless in the skull, wearing the regalia of their status, but wearing it on bones. They caused seizures in the children they touched. They drove men to madness through encounters at the crossroads. They seduced with the same beauty they had possessed in life, the same dangerous allure that the warriors had once found and followed and lost everything to. And this is the paradox I find myself sitting with when I think about the Cihuateteo, the one that the Aztec tradition does not resolve and does not try to resolve, because it is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be held. These are the most honored women in the culture. These are the women whose sacrifice was considered equal to the warrior's greatest act. These are the souls that accompanied the sun, that participated in the most sacred cosmological task, and they are feared. They are feared after 4 years in the same way that any power that has been acknowledged and honored and then released into the world is feared. The honor does not prevent the danger. The sacrifice does not preclude the predation. They are both of these things at once, fully, without resolution. The women who died in the highest act of service, and the women who returned to harm the children they could not save. Offerings were left at the crossroads to appease them on their return days. Specific rituals were observed. Children were kept inside. The crossroads were avoided, not because the Cihuateteo were unloved or disrespected, quite the contrary. They were honored, which makes the fear more complicated, not less. You can be afraid of something you love. You can dread the return of someone you revere. The Cihuateteo are the specific embodiment of that combination, that impossible holding of reverence and terror in the same hands at once. The Valley of Mexico is dark tonight. The lake around Tenochtitlan is still. The crossroads in the market are empty. It is not one of the dangerous days. The calendar does not mark tonight as a night of their return. But they have returned before, and they will return again on the appointed days, in their skeletal regalia, their status intact, and their hunger real, honored and feared, both. We have traveled very far tonight, from Babylon, where Lamashtu was already old when the first texts were written about her, through the Greek and Roman worlds, where the fear took new shapes and new names and began its long journey across Europe, into the Polish forests, where the double-souled woman walked and the community decided what to do about her, up to the Scottish Highlands, where 4 hunters made a wish in the dark, across to the subcontinent and into the archipelago, where the grief of dying in the process of giving life produced figure after figure after figure of the night-flying, blood-drinking woman who went to the children because she could not have her own, west to Ghana, and then across the Atlantic to Trinidad, where the story survived the unsurvivable and found new images for old fears. And finally, to the valley, where the Aztec world built its city on a lake and honored the women who died in childbirth and feared their return at the crossroads. I said at the beginning that I had been asking myself why. Why this figure? Everywhere. Always. Why the blood? Why always female? I do not have a single answer. I said I wouldn't, and I meant it. The single answer is always the wrong answer for something this large and this old and this genuinely mysterious. But I have some things I am more certain of than I was when we began. Blood is the substance of the threshold. It marks the entries and exits of life, birth, death, the monthly cycle that the cultures we visited tonight watched and feared and incorporated into their understanding of the female body as something fundamentally connected to the passage between states. To drink blood, in the mythological imagination, is to consume that threshold quality, to take in the substance of the transition between living and not living, to draw the boundary into yourself. Women, in almost every culture we visited tonight, were more closely identified with that threshold than men were. They were the ones who crossed it in childbirth, went to the edge of death, and came back with a new person, or sometimes didn't come back at all. The cultures that produced these figures knew from daily experience that the female body was in an intimate relationship with exactly the kinds of transition that blood marks. And the fear of that relationship, the specific fear of power that cannot be fully understood or controlled, went somewhere, into the stories, into the dark. The remarkable thing, when you look at all of them together, is not the fear. The fear is comprehensible. What is remarkable is the grief that runs through so many of them. Lamia losing her children, the Langsuir flying whinnying into the tree at the news of the stillbirth, the Churel dying in the failure of the people around her to care for her adequately, the Cihuateteo dying in the act of trying to bring life through their bodies, the Soucouyant, the old woman in her small house at the edge of the village, whose skin comes off at night, who is perhaps not simply a predator, but also something that lost too much and could not hold the shape of what it was. The grief is always there, underneath the horror. The hunger that was first a love, which does not make the blood-drinking woman safe. I'm not suggesting that. Lamashtu is genuinely terrifying. The Baobhan Sith leaves 3 dead men on the floor of a Highland body, and that is a real death and not metaphorical. The Penanggalan brings fever and disease to newborns who have done nothing to deserve it. But it makes her complex. It makes her human in the deepest sense of the word, generated by human grief, shaped by human fear, carrying in her every form the specific texture of what it was like to be a woman in the world that produced her. In all the difficulties and losses and unacknowledged powers that entailed, she is not simply a monster. She has never been simply a monster. She is what the monster contains. The night is very deep now. We have been in a great many darknesses tonight. The flat darkness of the Mesopotamian plain, the highland dark, the forest dark of Poland, the dense, warm dark of the Malaysian archipelago, the Caribbean night with its travelling fire, the valley dark of the Aztec world. All of them different, all of them containing, in their specific darkness, the same figure. She is quiet tonight, whatever she is, and wherever she is. In the groove of a Babylonian amulet, in the ankle-length hair concealing the hole in the neck, in the shed skin in the mortar, at the crossroads on a night that is not one of the dangerous days. She is quiet. Let that quiet reach you now. Not the quiet of the absence of danger. That is not what I am offering. And it would be dishonest to pretend the night contains only safe things, but the quiet that comes after a long journey. The quiet of having looked at something that frightened you and kept looking until you understood something more than the fear. The Langsuir is in her tree. The Soucouyant is back in her skin. The skin back on. The fireball settled back into the body of the old woman in the small house at the edge of the village. The Baobhan Sith are somewhere in the highland dark, and the deer hooves make no sound on the soft ground of the glen. And Lamashtu, the oldest, the daughter of the sky god, the one who was here before any of the others had names. Lamashtu is on her donkey, in the dark between the rivers, holding her snakes and nursing her dog and her pig, acting from her own will as she has always acted from her own will, indifferent to the amulets and the incantations and the 4,000 years of human effort to keep her at a distance. She is the oldest shape of the fear, and she is still there. Sleep now. The veil is thin tonight. It always is, in the places where the old things are, in the places where the blood was spilled and the names were spoken, and the skin was shed, and the fires moved across the dark sky above the cane fields. Sleep. She is not here. Or if she is, you have the salt. You have the seeds. You know her names now. And the known thing is always a little less powerful than the thing that has never been named.